Welcome to the podcast. To learn about key funding trends and market insight, the podcast is co-hosted by Connected International. Now, here's your host, Mike Shanley.
Welcome to the Global Strategy Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Shanley, and today our guest is David Berteau. David is the president and CEO of the Professional Services Council, PSC. He's been in that role since March 2016. PSC has more than 400 members and is the premier advocate of a resource for the federal services industry. I'll say we and my companies have been members of PSC for, I believe, close to, if not more than a decade now. Regardless of what part of the federal government you're working with, I would say you need to be a member of PSC. You need to attend their events. Upcoming events they have are the 2025 Federal Health Conference. That'll be May 22nd, hybrid. So virtual and in DC. I think that one's Bethesda. And then on June 5th, 2025 Federal Acquisition Conference. That one I think is in Arlington and will also be virtual. I'll be at both of those. Look forward to seeing you there. Definitely, if you're new to PSC, pick one of those, attend it, and learn what they're all about. So David, before leading the reins at PSC, was confirmed in 2014 as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Logistics and Material Readiness, where he oversaw the management of a $170 billion budget in the Department of Defense logistics funding. He also served as a senior vice president at the Center for Strategic International Studies, where his research and analysis covered federal budgets, national security management, contracting, logistics, acquisition, and industrial base issues. David, thank you very much for being here. Very timely, our show today, and appreciate you sharing the expertise from you and the PSC team.
Thank you, Mike. It's great to be here. And your timing is impeccable, right? We scheduled this weeks ago, not knowing that the Friday before we taped, the administration would release the outlines of its fiscal year 2026 budget, which they call a skinny budget. It's skinny in terms of pages, but not in terms of dollars.
We'll just pretend that we had the foresight and the accurate forecasting for that one there. So David,
give you full credit.
Wonderful. Let's jump right into it. David, Friday when, and that would be, today is May 6th when we're recording this. So last Friday when this came out, what was your initial reaction to seeing that budget request?
Well, we looked for three things right off the bat. Obviously, we care about the total dollars because that's ultimately, without money, there are no contracts, right? And so it's the source. And in many cases, the objective of the companies is to know not only how much money, but the second thing we look for is how is it divided up? How is it allocated? 15 cabinet departments, many separate agencies and subcomponents of those cabinet departments. And ultimately, the president's budget is, in fact, the starting point, not only of the negotiation with Congress, but it is the standing point at that point in time of the agencies planning for what they're going to do with that money. So the plans are consistent with what the administration proposes. Congress obviously gets a say. And so what ultimately gets spent may be different than what's proposed, but it does reflect what the agencies are planning for. So then the third thing we look for is, how does this fit with the trends of what we're seeing going on? What's being spent in FY26? What are the administration's priorities? Where are their cuts? Where are their increases? So we look for the puts and takes inside there as well as the overall top line.
I want to get into the budget request specifically, but touch on one thing you just mentioned there, Congress. Typically, if there's a divided government, that is quite a negotiation. Do you anticipate it being less of a negotiation and Congress likely passing something closer to the request than it would in most years? Or do you still anticipate there being some back and forth before the final budget comes out?
You're right. Congress, of course, is ultimately the place between the submission of the budget and the ultimate execution of the budget. The executive branch is the front end, they're at the back end. Congress gets its say in the middle. We've been doing this for a long time. This is my 8th transition. I first got involved in when Carter was transitioning to Reagan. And so Congress particularly has an important say on the president's first budget. So this is the first budget that the Trump administration submitted. They could have submitted something for 25, but instead we ended up with a continuing resolution for all of fiscal year 25. So in essence, the priorities within the budget right now are those that were set in fiscal year 24, which was in fact the budget that Joe Biden signed. And so this is particularly important because it's the first time, Mike, in living history that the entire federal government has operated under a full year continuing resolution, including the Defense Department. Never happened before. So fiscal year 25 is going to be unique in terms of that bridging from 24, the last Biden executed budget, to 26, the first proposed Trump budget. So we'll be looking very carefully at what the puts and takes are inside there.
Well, hopefully we'll have time to get back into what that means in that short term for 2025 for contractors, but look into 2026. What did we learn from what came out on Friday?
So three big takeaways. Number one is there are some increases. Those increases are primarily in defense. The administration gives you a very nice table, agency by agency, what was enacted in 25. So that's the continuing resolution totals, what's proposed for 26, and the percentage change. So you can see where the increases are, where the decreases are. So in defense and Homeland Security, the increases are more than 10% in defense, and actually more like 35% in Homeland Security. So that's a big point, is where those increases are. There are other increases. Transportation Department, for example, has an increase of about 5 or 6%. What we don't know is what's underneath that, right? Because they haven't yet released the level of detail that will let us see within that. Even in agencies where cuts are proposed, that doesn't mean every program is being cut. Every line item is being cut. Some may be increased, some may be decreased. We don't know the answers to that yet. We'll see what comes out going forward. The other thing you look for is, what does that do? Is there a spillback effect of that into FY25? And for that, we look at something that the administration refers to, which is rescissions. Here again, Congress has a role. Under the Budget Act of 1974, the president can propose rescinding prior year appropriations, take the money back, don't spend it, in other words, and Congress has an affirmative responsibility. If within 45 days they approve those rescissions, then the administration doesn't have to spend the money. If in fact they fail to approve it, or in fact vote to reject it, then theoretically the administration has to spend the money. This administration has said, we're not sure we agree with that. We think under the unitary executive theory that the administration has espoused, which goes back at least to President Nixon, that the president has the authority, notwithstanding the law and Supreme Court decisions, that to not spend money that Congress appropriates if they don't believe that money should be spent. That may be tested. It's not being tested in the courts yet, but it is inherent inside what the budget proposal is there. So we do see in the budget list dollars that are reported to be part of a rescission package that we haven't seen yet. We expect, for example, a big chunk of that rescission would be funds made available for the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is essentially gone away under this administration with most contracts and programs terminated. If Congress agrees to rescind that money, then they don't have to spend it. We don't know what happens if Congress doesn't agree to rescind it, because there's no USAID remaining really to spend that money. So we'll have to see what comes out of that. A lot of uncertainty there, but that's what we're watching for.
What are you hearing from your members? What's the so what at this point, based on these two PDF files that were released on Friday, for how they're responding? Does this really confirm what a lot of people are reading in the tea leaves on the priorities? Were there key surprises in here? What's the market feeling like?
So Mike, PSC is almost unique in the association business. We focus only on federal government contracting. Our members are only private sector for-profit companies, so there's not a lot of nonprofits or non-government organizations involved. And we cover the entire federal government, every agency from, agriculture to treasury and transportation and everything in between. Probably even the zoo, if I'm looking for something with a Z there. And as a result, we're covering all of that waterfront. Some of our member companies have seen not exactly business as usual, but by and large, things proceeding at a normal pace. Contracts are being solicited, evaluated, and awarded. Options are being exercised. Funds are being expended. Results are being delivered. There's a lot of churn up in the atmosphere, but on the day-to-day ground level, work's moving on, right? In other areas, of course, the USAID is an extreme example. So much work has gone away. Companies are actually going out of business. And they're not only going out of business because the future work is going away, they're going out of business because the administration has dragged its feet in terms of paying invoices for work done under previous contracts that was required to be done. Costs were incurred, invoices submitted, and companies aren't being reimbursed. If you're going to get paid for the work you've done and already spent the money, it's pretty hard to stay in business. So it really ranges from the Yeah, it's kind of business as usual, maybe a little bit slower with a few more hiccups and a few more loops you have to go through to. It's the devastation of the entire industry, and it ranges across the board within PSC.
Well, you mentioned, yeah, DoD and DHS had maybe the biggest winners, the biggest increases. A lot of other ones, HHS, I think it was 20, 30, 40%-ish cuts in there. You mentioned USA and state really seemed to stand out at, it was 83% or so of maybe 80% plus proposed cuts there. Did you have any thoughts on why that line item really was standing out? I noticed too, they put it at the top of the memo as well that was released.
And in many ways, that was not a surprise because the magnitude of those cuts had already been adequately described in previous administration statements and obviously in their action. You asked early on, though, about what does Congress come into play here, right? And so, at the moment, Congress, hasn't rescinded the money. The money is still appropriated. The fact that the administration has not spent it or obligated it, while relevant, I mean, we're in month 8 of the fiscal year, right? So we still have more than 4.5 months before the end of the fiscal year. So technically, if you haven't spent the money yet, it doesn't mean you aren't going to spend it. You've got the rest of the fiscal year. And as you well know, the fourth quarter of any fiscal year is the biggest quarter in terms of spending and contract obligations. So that remains ahead of us. But the reality is they're not spending the money and don't look like they plan to spend the money. And now based on 26, it says this is a permanent end to that reduction. Where does Congress come into play? Well, we're going to watch two things. Number one is there a rescission package? Because there are $9 billion, I think, listed in those documents for rescissions associated with USAID and the State Department. Congress will get a say in that regard. And then what does Congress do with the FY26 proposal? The state and foreign ops subcommittees of the appropriations committees will, in fact, sit down, take testimony, look at the administration proposal, mark up language. What we don't know, and this is what's different than has been the case for 12 of the last 14 years, there's no preconceived cap in place. There's no ceiling above which Congress can't go. And then they would divide up that cap. We had 10 years under the Budget Control Act caps, starting in FY12, going all the way through fiscal year 21. Then we took a couple of years off. And then we had the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023, which put caps in place for fiscal year 24 and 25. That was part of the last debt ceiling deal. So we had caps, right? Now, those caps are not agency by agency. They're in the aggregate. There's a separate cap for DOD and then a cap for everybody else. Within that cap, some increase, some decrease. But here's the thing that's not really discussed much. In Trump 1, they proposed similar steep cuts in civilian agencies in all 4 budgets that Trump proposed, fiscal year 18, 19, 20, and 21. But there were caps in place, and those caps were the ceiling, but in effect, the ceiling also became the floor. They were the same. So in the end, in the aggregate, Congress appropriated not to the cut level proposed, but to the cap that was in place. Here's the thing, though, Mike. For fiscal year 26, there are no caps. That means there's no floor. So what do we look for that might be the cap? I look at the FY25 budget resolution. All the talk is on the reconciliation, the tax extenders and the cuts in Medicaid and the cuts in SNAP and other programs, right? But the reality is there's a budget table in that budget resolution that by appropriation subcommittee lays out 10 years of targeted dollars for those appropriation subcommittees. And 2 things come out at you when you look at that table. Well, first, you got to do a little arithmetic. One is every single entry, 10 years of defense, 10 years of non-defense, is lower than the same number was last year under Biden. Lower. It doesn't even accommodate inflation. It's lower in current dollar value. The second is that it's a lot lower on the civilian side, and again, disparate for each agency, but it's not the same reductions as in the president's budget. So there's already a disconnect between what Congress set as its targets, not as a statutory cap, but certainly as the only indicator we have of what their thinking is and what the president has proposed. We haven't finished our analysis yet at PSC of where those gaps are, but we're going to be looking at that very closely in the coming weeks.
What are some of the key takeaways from that? The business development, let's say the federal growth implications for partners. And David, so I'm just going to throw it in here. Let's talk about both those established contractors as well as new people, despite the cuts, that might see an opportunity to enter the market. I'm thinking specifically on the defense side in AI or cyber. What are some of the implications for the federal growth side for this?
We've been through ups and downs before in the federal budget. I mean, I've been through two big defense builds ups and two big drawdowns, and to the point of 50% over a matter of a number of years. There's always opportunity, regardless of which direction the overall budget is going. Within that budget, there are programs that are growing, there are programs that are shrinking, there are programs that are stable, but in which change can come into play. And you focus on, new companies. Well, one of the drivers of that is innovation. How does the government access bold new ideas that somebody else has come up with that weren't paid for by government funding? We don't have a good track record of that, but it's clear that a lot of innovation now occurs outside federal funding in the commercial marketplace, both in America and around the world. So there's two big dynamics there. One is within those overall trends, there's lots of opportunities. And obviously the companies have to get down into the level of detail, talk to their customers, talk to the programs. What are the opportunities? Watch what Congress does, see where that funding is going to come into play. And when that funding becomes available, be ready to bid on it. But there's also an opportunity now that's a little bit different. And this is not so much in the budget, but we're seeing it in a lot of what the administration is talking about in the rewrite of the federal acquisition regulation, in the push towards using more commercial products. An idea that, in fact, we need to focus on results and outcomes. Now, this is a big change. I mean, Mike, you've been in this business a long time. An awful lot of what the government buys is they buy input. So many labor hours, so many categories, so many lines of code, et cetera. To define the results you want as an agency, and then to solicit, evaluate, and award and manage and administer contracts that deliver those results is an enormous challenge, but an enormous opportunity. I know that from my perspective, PSC member companies, when given the opportunity to say, here's what the government wants as a result, we can in fact pose ways that deliver those results better and faster and cheaper than the government's getting it today, whether it's a new supplier or a traditional government contractor who's been in business a long time. Now, I can't tell you where those opportunities are yet because I don't have the detail, but I know they're there because they're there every year.
Well, we'll have to check back in on that. That was obviously going to be the follow-up there, David. Where are you seeing those? So we'll cover that on the next chat. Going back to, I always find for times like this where there is a lot of change and very significantly shifting markets, the historical context is helpful to both understand where we're at, as well as provide potentially some roadmaps for where things are going. Having seen multiple transitions, what do you see that has been typical, not atypical, but what's been typical about this transition compared to the, I think you said 8 or so previous ones?
I think it's a good question, or it's a question which I don't have a stock answer, so that makes it a good question. Okay, but the two that come to my mind, number one is every administration wants to, when it comes in, figure out how to align the programs and projects in place with its priorities. Now, sometimes those priorities don't change all that much. Other times they change a whole lot. For example, when George H.W. Bush took over from Ronald Reagan, we were still in the middle of the Cold War. Many of the programs were continuing. Then all of a sudden, in year one, the Berlin Wall falls, the Warsaw Pact collapses, the Cold War is over, the defense budget gets cut in half over the course of 3 years. There's no continuity at all, right? So you might have come in thinking that you were going to keep going and align it, but it did give the Bush administration the opportunity to take this new world, a world in which the Cold War was not the dominating driver of defense, and reshape its priorities so that they fit into the projects that were going to go forward. Took years to do that, but that's an extreme example of where that happened. And it happened successfully over time, but not all at once. So that's one thing, one continuity that's similar. This administration certainly wants to make sure that programs and projects are aligned with its priorities. So every administration does that. The second is they want their people in place. And what's intriguing there is this administration, while it's technically the second Trump term, it's not a second term in the normal sense of the word. Every other second term, you were already in office when the second term started. So there's a continuity, there's people in place. You don't have to replace everybody all at once. In fact, you can figure out who you want to keep and who you want to get rid of, and you can take time to do that. So this administration, while it's a second term, is really a second first term. They're starting from nobody in place. They got to put all their people in place. So the second common thread is identifying the people you need, getting them through the process, whether just political appointees in the building or whether going through the Senate confirmation process. I would say that atypical, President-elect Trump back in November and December was nominating folks at a faster pace than is typically the case, more like a first term than a second term. And Congress has, in fact, moved rather swiftly to wrestle with those, although obviously the votes have to be there. And so in some cases that takes a little time. But those are two very common threads. Align with your programs, your priorities, align the programs with your priorities, and get your people in place.
And at the risk of asking an obvious question, what has been unusual or different about this transition?
I could almost say it's both usual and unusual. Every administration distrusts the career civil service that's already in place.
That's not a new thing you're seeing.
It's not unusual. It's very, very common. And in fact, if I go back to Carter to Reagan, there was an acronym that the Reagan team used, BOCA, the bad old Carter administration, right? And because the career folks see their job as to aligning with those priorities of the administration, they don't see themselves as part of the old team. They see themselves as part of the process to implement the new team's work. But it always takes a while for that to sort itself out. The suspicion on the part of the political appointees, the reliance on the part of the career civil servants. This administration has carried that further than many have. And in fact, one of the sort of tangential consequences of that for government contractors is the government personnel themselves have a host of uncertainties with which they have to deal. And that's abnormally high compared to a typical transition. The hiring freeze is typical. Every administration has a hiring freeze in place. The regulatory freeze is typical. Every administration freezes regulations until they have a chance to see what's going on. The deferred resignation program is unique and new. The DRP that thousands, tens of thousands of folks have agreed to. So they're on the payroll, but not working through September. The voluntary early retirement programs, the reductions in force, they're not atypical, but they don't occur at every administration. But I think I don't have a way of measuring this, but my sense is that many government employees have more uncertainty about the continuity of their jobs than is typically the case in a transition. But it's not a difference of direction. It's a difference of magnitude and pace.
Given that these massive staffing changes, layoffs, reduction in force across the government, how does that affect, what's the so what for the contractors and the federal growth? You have less staff to do the work. Does that mean more reliance on contractors? You also have less staff to process awards and push things out the door and put out RFPs. So can you talk a bit about how you approach analyzing the implications of that for the federal partners?
It's early to tell where it's going to settle down, but you've raised the right questions, right? So in agencies where substantial reductions have already occurred, we see it in education, we see it now in Health and Human Services, we see it in U.S. Agency for International Development and State Department. Even those where there's still work going on, there's uncertainty at multiple levels, and so the pace is slower and the certainty is less. Right? There's more lack of clarity on a lot of things, including when my option expires, will there be anybody there to exercise it? And an extreme example, for instance, within the U.S. Agency for International Development, thousands of terminations for convenience were issued. The government always has the right. This is kind of unique to the federal government in the contracting world. The government has the right to terminate any contract at any time for no reason. Within any commercial contract world and within most state government worlds, a contract that's terminated without a cause has to have consideration. Usually that means some kind of money, some payment back for obligated expenses, et cetera. The federal government has the right to terminate a contract without cause at any time for no reason whatsoever. But they have an affirmative responsibility to do two things. Number one, to work with the contractor to accumulate the costs that first of all, some costs are incurred already. They just haven't been invoiced yet when the contract is terminated. And you can't terminate a contract without work. It takes work to terminate a contract, right? There's a lot of steps required in a contract termination. You can't take those steps without paying somebody. So you're going to incur costs to terminate. These are called termination costs, right? And so the administration typically is required to appoint a TCO, a termination contracting officer, to work with the company on what costs are allowable, what data are required, how do you submit them? You get a claim, we're going to adjudicate the claim and ultimately pay you to close out the contract. There's nobody there to be the TCO. And now the administration has since appointed, I believe, 100 termination contracting officers for 5,000 something contracts. So that's a pretty big workload. Typically one might have 10. Now they got 50, right? In this regard. So it'll be abnormal in terms of that, but there are responsibilities and processes laid out in that regard. If you don't have enough people, it's pretty hard for the companies to get that claim in and to get it paid. If the company doesn't get paid and they've incurred the cost, that puts an additional burden on them. How can they even stay in business? Because ultimately, if you spend money and you don't get it paid back, you're going to go broke.
Going on talking about the pipeline development side of it, with the RFPs, the RFIs, pre-solicitations, all that. I think it's been uneven across the board, across the agencies. Some are at a full stop for new RFPs. Some are still coming out. Do you anticipate by October, starting, next fiscal year, that there will be a cadence? Or do you anticipate that it will be a atypical, unpredictable pipeline RFP release cadence over the next few years?
This is so important to government contractors, and it's important to the government, although sometimes the government doesn't recognize it. It takes so long to bid, win, and award contracts that companies have to prepare well in advance of a solicitation in order to be able to actually put a decent bid in and have a chance of winning. When I was in the business, one of our rules were, if the first time you hear about an opportunity is when the solicitation is released, don't bother bidding, because you're obviously way behind the power curve in that regard. Well, at PSC, one of the things that we've done for a number of years, you've probably seen it and maybe even reported on it in your show, is we do an assessment of agency forecasts, right? And we have a set of 15 criteria, and we evaluate probably 70 or more agencies and subcomponents of cabinet departments on how well their forecasts are structured, how accessible it is, how complete the information is. We don't actually grade them on did they do what they say they were going to do when they were going to do it, because we know they'd all flunk in that regard, but they're not because of their own intentions. And these are really useful for both the agencies and for contractors to know what's coming and what do we need to be getting ready for. Companies only have a limited amount of money they can spend on bid and proposal. It's not infinite, and it's real dollars, and you have to take it out of profit. So there's an opportunity cost there. You want to spend your money on those things that have the best chance of happening and your best chance of winning. Right now, Mike, across the government, those forecast pages in most agencies are either wildly wrong or they're dark. They're not even there anymore. We've actually canceled this year's assessment of forecast because our assessment is we can't produce anything useful in that process. But it doesn't mean companies don't need to figure out what's going to be up for bid and when. And so this is where communications with your customer is important, right? And hopefully they're going to be able to help you in that regard, but also where the budget details come into play. Because if it's in the budget, that means they're planning to award a contract. Congress has got to have its say. You're going to be a year before we get to the point of having the money available, but it's a very strong indicator. If it's not in the budget, maybe you don't want to put a whole lot of stock into preparing and spending a lot of money on putting the bid together. There's a second aspect of this, which is after you submit the bid, oftentimes the government is late in awarding the contract. You want to go into that?
Yes. I think it's obvious how we anticipate that happening. I don't see those awards coming out any quicker.
No, one of the things that we did at PSC a number of years ago is we required the government to do three things in statute. We require them to define procurement and administrative lead time. The acronym is PALT, P-A-L-T. We required them, the law requires them to measure how long it takes how long PALT is, how long it takes to get contracts awarded. And the third is to make the results of that publicly available. Well, the law's only been in place for a little while, and frankly, hasn't been very well implemented by the executive branch. But we do have some data from some agencies. And what it shows, first of all, the definition, by the way, was a little tricky because half of the delay is before the solicitation. But ultimately, the only thing we can really measure with definitiveness or got agreement with the government we can measure is less defined, Paul, as solicitation to award. Pretty straightforward. There's a lot of delay in pre-solicitation. My only concern is we have trouble getting agreement on when pre-solicitation starts. We know when it ends. It ends when you issue the solicitation. But when does pre-solicitation start? I have some ideas there, but we haven't sold the government on that. But just within that narrow band of solicitation to award, what the data we have show is it's taking longer in every type of contract, in every size of contract, everywhere we can measure. We knew that, but we didn't have data to prove it before. Now we have data to prove it, and it's the government's own data. That, among other things, gives us a chance to say, okay, what do we do about that? Because if you don't have data, you can't measure the effect of any change that you're making. Now we have that. Set that aside. We know it takes longer, and it's probably taking longer still. And so I think that what you often have is the government will come back after you've submitted your proposal and say, we would like you to extend the validity of this proposal for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year. We have some proposals that are 2 or 3 years old. What do you have to do if you're the bidder? Well, you've got key personnel in those bids, right? And if you lose those key personnel, you may end up being disqualified. Your bid may be thrown out. You may not ever get to orals, right? So it's a really tough thing for the company to keep those people on the payroll so that they can, in fact, sustain the validity of their bid. It's easier when you're in a growing industry. When you're in a shrinking industry, it gets harder still. This is something that the government doesn't have much sympathy for, but we think it's essential. And at PSC, we're going to help them understand this.
Well, David, a lot more to get into when we talk again. Maybe we'll check back in later this year. Just to wrap up, for those who want to join PSC or attend the conferences, what's the best way for them to contact your team?
So everything's on our website, www.pscouncil, just one C at the front end there, pscouncil.org. You can join, you can register for conferences. Non-members can register and attend every conference. And virtually all of our conferences, I think nearly all of our conferences, except for our annual conference down at the Greenbrier, which is members only, are a hybrid conference. There's in-person as well as virtual attendance. We all have learned, Mike, under COVID, that there's still no substitute for face-to-face in person. And by the way, one of the dynamics there, and then I'll close it out for you, is the government is having a little trouble delivering. You've seen this in your own work, right? Sometimes it's hard to get a government person to show up at a conference, or they'll ask permission and not get a yes or a no, or at the last minute, you'll get a cancellation. We are putting our conferences together independent of any particular company, agency, or personnel from the government being able to participate. We'll certainly have that true at our Fed Health Conference later this month and at our acquisition conference in June. Welcome all who want to attend. Go to pscouncil.org, look at events. You can register for these events. I look forward to seeing you there, Mike, and I look forward to seeing all your listeners there as well. Thank you.
David, pleasure having you on the show, and I will see you in person at the upcoming Health and Acquisition Conference. Thank you again. I really appreciate you having on the podcast today.
You are welcome in any time.
Talk to you soon, David. Bye.
Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's show, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and connect with Mike Shanley on LinkedIn.